Welcome back to the podcast world, folks. This is an unusual occurrence, a first, actually, a meeting together of two institutions. That's why you didn't hear the regular music to start with, as we're doing the rarest of rare things, a combo episode of CrimsonCast and podcast on the Brink. I've got Alex Bozich with me from inside the hall. Alex, great to talk to you again, and quite a unique time here in IU basketball. It feels like we were just doing this 4 years ago, and in fact we were. We're back once again, and I appreciate you joining me on this show. We're going to talk about the Archie Miller situation, IU basketball in general, and we've got some questions that we're fielding as well from Twitter. So it should be a fun hour. So how are you doing today?
I'm a little tired, but I'm here. I'm showing up, and I'm excited. I mean, Galen, we had a conversation a couple weeks ago. We've talked through direct messages for a while now, and I think that I can't speak for you, but I had come to the conclusion that something was going to have to give here. The situation with IU basketball, to me, it just gotten so bleak in terms of hope from the fan base and the expectation that things could ever get better under the previous coaching staff, that a move was going to have to be made. And so while I never applaud somebody losing their job, I mean, we also have to remember there's a lot of people, support staff and such, that are going to be impacted by this. It's not just Archie Miller and his family. There's a lot of people. I also think that what we saw yesterday from Scott Dolson is he's not afraid to make a big move. And so whether that works out, it remains to be seen. But I like the aggressiveness. I like the statement that, he agrees with the fan base that what he was seeing was not good enough, and then he understood that doing another year of this just wasn't going to work out. So, that's kind of where I stand on it. My head, I think I messaged you late last night that my head was kind of spinning. I was listening to your conversation with Scott. I listened to some of the podcasts this morning that you had with Chronic Hoosier. Just so much great content out there right now to consume. And it just feels like we've been re-energized, right, Galen? Yeah. I mean, I was not looking forward to an off season of writing about, the transfer portal and the context that it was going to be at that time. Basically, Archie Miller was going to need transfers in order to save his program. There was not going to be a lot to talk about on a weekly podcast episode. And now I feel like, not just the fan base, but those of us who cover IU basketball and those of us who, talk about it on the various platforms, we've been given new life in a sense.
Yes, I like the way that you put that. I'll say this, first of all. No one sheds a tear for the writer or the podcaster who's, regularly covering a sports team that isn't good, because as a fan, you can see just as well as that person can how bad the product is and how difficult it is to watch the games. So I'm not expecting any sympathy from people on that. But I will say that as someone who's tried to cover all of the games and record shows afterwards and talk with people about things and tweet about it, it's just been a slog. Like for 4 years, it was like there was this constant weight on everybody's shoulders, in the program, covering the program, fans of the program, waiting for things to get better, waiting for the sunshine to poke through. This year was, I think, the worst of all of those, because there were some, I think, heightened expectations coming into this season. There were some early successes, much like there were in the previous year. And then once the Big Ten started, it's like, well, we're back to exactly where we were before, perhaps even worse. The offense looked even gunkier than it has. The defense didn't look as good. There was a lack of crispness. Everything felt like a battle. And that takes a big toll on a fan base in particular, when it's just not fun, and when the style of play isn't fun, and when there's not a lot of personality from the coach, from the players. There's not a lot of insights into who those people are and what they're doing. I know you were talking about this on the Assembly Call podcast yesterday. It really makes it just not fun and not something that you want to engage in. And so the psychological weight I feel that got lifted yesterday morning about 24 hours ago with the announcement that Archie Miller was being fired. It's easy as an outsider to look at that and say, well, here's IU fans and media dancing on Archie Miller's grave professionally. It's not really that. It's exactly what you said. It's like, wow, there's cause to be optimistic again. There's cause to feel like things are going to get better and get back to a point where it's a fun basketball team to watch.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you mentioned the fans and us. I mean, also, it couldn't have been fun for the players, right? That scene that played out in Lucas Oil Stadium where Indiana, for I believe the second time this season, was playing in front of fans. The other time would have been the Florida State game on the road, which was a road environment. So, it wouldn't have been a situation at that time where anyone was even thinking about Archie Miller or his job. And obviously it's not a home game, but this was the first time that Indiana played all season in its backyard. You had the backdrop of the NCAA tournament, a week later played solely in the state of Indiana, and Indiana takes the court. The players looked defeated to me for a good part of that second half. I mean, we've seen this same story now play out over the last couple of weeks where they have maybe a 10 or a 15-minute stretch within a game where they play somewhat well, and then something goes wrong and the confidence is just completely zapped out of them. And then to have chance of fire Archie, and then the players being booed with missing free throws in the second half, not making a field goal the last 9 minutes. I mean, it's just not fun for anybody. So I think in some way, the players, there may be a sense of relief for them. I have not talked to them, but the sense that I got the last couple weeks just from talking to people was that there was not a lot of fun being had. And why would there be? You're losing games. People are heavily scrutinizing the play of this team. They're wondering what's going wrong. And I know you brought up kind of what I said yesterday on the assembly call. This is not something that I think a lot of people think about because they're so tied into wins and losses. But when, as a fan base, that you don't feel as though you have any connection to players or to a coach, you don't feel like you know them on any level other than the 40 minutes that they show up to play on your TV this season, you're not going to have much grace when things go wrong. You're not going to have much sympathy. You're going to be angry. And I think that was one of the fatal, we can talk about this more if you want, or we can get on to other things, but I think that was one of the fatal mistakes that Archie Miller made when he came to Indiana, is that he came in the press conference, right, and he won the first press conference. He said all of the right things. Yeah. But after that, I don't think that he really understood the gravity of what it means to be the IU basketball coach in terms of what it takes from a PR perspective, what it takes in terms of selling the program, what it takes in terms of connecting with former players. It would have been fine if he would have won a lot of games. Right. But he didn't win enough games, and then that's what everybody else starts talking about and thinking about it. And so, yeah, it was – I mean, I think you put it pretty well. I mean, it does kind of feel like a big, giant weight is lifted off the shoulders of a lot of people.
And I think, to be fair, we talked about this with Chronic Hoosier last night, the wins and losses were the most important thing. Like the constant – finishing at 500 or worse in the conference was the thing that ultimately got Archie Miller fired. And I don't know if the PR aspects or the marketing aspects of things would have helped that much against that, but I do think it would have given a little bit more leeway. I feels like so much of the Archie Miller era was on the margins. It was always, well, they would have been better if this guy hadn't gotten injured, or if this recruit had come instead of that recruit, or if they'd won one or two more games in this year or that year. And I think the PR part kind of fits into that. It's like, would Archie Miller have ultimately gotten fired given the overall string of results? Probably. But if there'd been a bit more of a relationship built up there between Miller and the fan base, because honestly, I think that might have been what, to some degree, kept Crean around as long as it did. Because even though Crean gradually backed away from the fan base, he built up a lot of goodwill in those first 5 years. He was very active in promoting the program and putting himself out there to fans, even in the really bad first 3 years. And then obviously that paid off with some success in years 4 and 5. So there are some lessons, I think, to be learned there in terms of just, how much on the margins this stuff can be.
Yeah, I mean, you're exactly right in terms of the wins and losses, though. I want to say it was my dad that wrote something about this a couple of weeks ago when things were really starting to go south, and I don't necessarily remember what the exact phrase was, but I think he said, they were basically good enough to hang in with a lot of teams and not get blown out, but they were never good enough to kind of get over the hump and win. And I think that really epitomizes all 4 seasons, right? You go back to the first year and they were right around that 500 mark. And you think back to that and you think, there's 3 or 4 games there. If they win a couple of those, they're an NIT team. Maybe they're thinking about making the NCAA tournament. And the second season, I think, looking back on it now, it's crazy that we're even to this point have this conversation. But looking back on it, April 30th, 2018, when I was standing in the high school gym of the school that I attended, Romeo Langford commits to Indiana. In many ways, that was the high point of the Archie Miller era at Indiana, right? That was when there was the biggest amount of hope. And that second season where he had all of those expectations with Romeo and Jawan, and really just needed to make the tournament. Couldn't do it. You can argue that he was going to make it last year, but it wasn't going to be as anything more than a 10 or 11 seed. And then this year, it's more of the same. I mean, they're good enough to beat some teams like in Iowa a couple times, but they're also not good enough to beat Rutgers at all and lose to them 3 times. So it was just. It was the results were so just kind of average to below average that, there wasn't enough else there beyond that to justify moving forward.
One of the hallmarks, for lack of a better term, of the Archie Miller era was something that you just mentioned there. Like his teams were generally good enough to stick around with a bunch of competition. They didn't win a lot of the games, particularly against good competition or well-coached competition. And there were these long stretches in almost every game where the team looked completely disassociated from each other, looked like they didn't know what they were running or how it should have looked. What do you attribute that to? Because it's a weird thing. When you watch Archie Miller's teams at Dayton, they looked very coherent. They looked very together. They weren't always that talented, but they played very hard. That really isn't how I would describe how these IU teams have played with each other during his tenure. And we saw almost an entire personnel changeover from day one to the last day, and it really looked like the same thing all the way through. You've watched a lot of basketball, a lot of IU basketball. What would you attribute that to?
I just feel like the players were never confident in what they were trying to do on a game-to-game basis. There was, in many ways, I think you need to, like any person in leadership in any organization, this goes for, me running a website, you running the media school, you need to empower the people that you're overseeing to do the best in the role that you're assigning them to. And I just never felt like he made that connection with the players and gave them confidence on a game-to-game basis. I mean, Rob Fennessy, and I've talked about this a lot the last couple of weeks, he was never a blue chip 5-star kind of player coming in, but I watched him a lot in high school. I remember when he was a sophomore for McCutcheon, he went to the state championship game. I remember watching him in some AAU games. He wasn't a guy that was going to blow you away statistically, but he played with a confidence that, it felt like he was a leader on the court. And for a time as a freshman, he hits that shot against Butler and he does some other good things, but I don't know if it was an injury or something else, but it just never seemed like he developed into that sturdy, confident guy that I thought that he had the potential to. And a lot of that has to come down to coaching, right? I mean, I think that there's something to leadership in that you have to make guys feel good about what they're doing. And you looked at Indiana's players this season, in most cases, when things got started to go wrong, they were looking around for answers, and there was nobody there to give them those answers. And so, I mean, I hate to simplify it, Galen, and say that it's just confidence, but from talking to people, close to players, and from just observing the games, that's what I saw in most cases. It was guys who, when things started to go wrong, they didn't have anything to fall back on. And to me, a lot of that has to be coaching. What did you see? Do you agree with that? It just didn't seem like there was any cohesiveness and any confidence in the plan of what they were trying to do on a game-to-game basis.
It felt like when the plan was going well, everybody felt confident. And when something happened to suddenly make the plan not go well, they went to pieces. And this is why you'd have these long droughts, not just offensively, that's what everybody focused on, but that was almost always coupled with defense breaking down on the other end of the floor and the other team racking up points while IU sitting there essentially not knowing what to do with the basketball. And yeah, I agree with you. I think that I've said on CrimsonCast several times that it doesn't make any sense to me that Archie Miller and his staff would have recruited a team full of players who were incapable of shooting. I think all of these guys, if you put them in an open gym, or if you just had them shooting on a basket, would look like players from Illinois, players from Michigan. Like, I don't think there's that big of a difference in the raw skill. But when you put that onto the floor and you're asking them to operate within the confines of a system, and you're asking them to operate under the aegis of a coach who's trying to get them to do X, Y, and Z as a unit, I do think that a lack of confidence was there. I think that there was a lack of belief on the part of the players that what they were doing was going to actually result in an outcome. And any amount of reading about coaches or reading about psychology of leadership knows that you have to really make the people that are working for you envision what can be if they follow the plan. And that just never really seemed to take hold. There were a few random moments where it would poke through. The game at home versus Minnesota was a good example of that this year, where it was like, oh, hey, they look like a relatively confident team who's able to score and do all of these things. Now, part of that, I think, was just how many problems Minnesota themselves had with that same
exactly.
But when you're only winning games against teams that have worse confidence issues than you do, that's not a long-term path to success. And you look at the struggles that Archie Miller had against Matt Painter, against Steve Peichel, against some of the other coaches in the Big Ten who do a really good job of organizing their teams and whose teams don't seem to lose confidence. I mean, Rutgers...
Beeline and Howard?
Yeah. Rutgers on a couple of occasions this season went down by a significant amount to IU early, and yet you never got the feeling that IU was going to put them away. You always felt like Rutgers was going to have the confidence to stay the course and come back, whereas when it was IU in that position, rarely did that happen. You touched on something also that's interesting, though, which is the developmental aspect. And this is where I find the Archie Miller era to be really a mixed bag, because you can't say he didn't develop the players that he recruited. I think Race Thompson has certainly developed really well over the course of his 3 years. I think he's got a ceiling, but what he does within that ceiling certainly looks really good. I think Armand Franklin made a big leap from last year to this year, and yet there's other players that just didn't happen for one reason or another. There's some players that washed out relatively quickly. I was reading something yesterday about how one of the problems with Archie was he was getting the top-level recruits, but the depth pieces that you need to be, to run a team and to have them be successful, the guys that aren't 5 stars, he really struggled both in recruiting those players and then developing them once they were here. And again, I don't know that that's something that I would have expected. But it particularly from a guy in Archie Miller who was at a Dayton where you had to recruit nothing but role players and kind of gritty types of guys who you could develop over 4 years because you weren't going to get the top level players coming out of high school. I mean, I don't know. What was your thought on the way the player development happened over the time that Miller was the coach?
Hey, it's Jared. I'm going to jump in here real quick to talk about Home Field Apparel, our friends at homefieldapparel.com. And there are several reasons why you need to go to homefieldapparel.com to upgrade your Indiana University sports wardrobe. Number one, all of their materials are so comfortable. I have the hoodies. I have a crew neck sweatshirt. I just received my LEO t-shirt that they have. and all of the materials are so soft. It feels so good against your body. And what's nice is that they still feel soft even after you wash them. Because a lot of materials, you get them, you wash them, they don't feel as nice. Home Field Apparel stuff really does. So you can count on that. Plus, they have logos there that you're not going to find anywhere else. That's kind of their thing. You know, they have over 90 different schools that they work with now. They go and find these old brand marks and logos and mascots that, you know, haven't been used in 40, 50 years, sometimes longer, and they bring them back. And so it's this great way to indulge your love of nostalgia, find these old logos that you haven't seen. And so when you go there, you'll be able to browse. I mean, for Indiana stuff, they have, 2 pages worth of gear that you can see, stuff on T-shirts, stuff on crew necks, stuff on sweaters, such comfortable stuff. And it's not just IU. You may have people in your life that went to school somewhere else. Sorry for those folks, but, they may have. And you can find so much gear for other schools as well. And even better, you can save when you go there because our promo code BRINK, B-R-I-N-K, will help you save 20% on your entire order. So go to homefieldapparel.com, use that promo code BRINK, B-R-I-N-K, and get 20% off your entire order. All right, back to the show.
I think Armand Franklin and Race Thompson on this year's team, Armand Franklin, Race Thompson, Trace Jackson Davis are 3 guys that I can look at and say that they got better to some degree. I think differing degrees on all 3, particularly this season. I go back to Finney. I don't know all the dynamics of that one, but I feel like he's a guy who regressed. But overall, I was not overly impressed with the development because most of the players lacked the ability to do basic fundamental things that you need to do to win basketball games, like take care of the ball, make a simple entry pass, shoot free throws, make 3-pointers on occasion. There was, to me, too much of an emphasis on I don't know. I don't really know a good way to say it, but there was not enough emphasis made on the little details that win you basketball games. And you can argue that he needed to recruit better shooters, but at the same time, I also believe a lot you are as a team usually what you emphasize, and to have 4 straight seasons where you're that inept at doing a basic thing that your system requires you to do to win, right? I mean, their system was all based on drawing fouls and getting to the line, and they excelled at that system, but then they got to the line and they couldn't actually make the shots. So how is that any way to consistently win? And it really surprised me from the standpoint of when Archie Miller came in, and from everybody I talked to when the hire was made, I really liked the hire, and I thought that Indiana was going to get away from, the Crean years where, it was basically you brought in a lot of talent, as much talent as possible, let guys have freedom, and a lot of times you just win the game because you're more talented or you can make a lot of 3-pointers or that. I thought Archie was going to be more of a nuts and bolts guy where he was going to have his team completely cohesive and organized, and to his credit, that's, I think, a lot of what people saw at Dayton. But at Indiana, it was not that. It was, this system that felt very rigid and lacked adjustments, and like you said, when he had to go to the second or third option in terms of what was going on in a half-court possession, there was really never much success. Like if the first thing didn't work, the second or third thing wasn't going to work usually. And then with the defensive stuff, they were so susceptible to huge 3-point barrages from the other team. And we saw it in the first game that he ever coached at Indiana, losing to Indiana State on the home court, and they make, 19? I don't remember exactly how many threes it was, but it was a lot. And so I think it's fine. It was fine mostly in terms of individual guys getting better, but the team, in terms of the system, never really grasped what they were trying to do. And I think the results kind of showed that, because consistently over a period of time, he was losing 10, 11, 12 games a year at least, and most of the games looked the same. I mean, Galen, I told you before that writing 5 takeaways after every game became basically saying the same thing every game, right? They missed a bunch of free throws. Some games they turned it over, and they couldn't make enough perimeter shots. To me, that tells me that he wasn't doing a good enough job developing his team. You can talk about individual players all you want, but to me, the team never consistently got better.
Yeah, and it just seemed like there weren't a lot of ideas on how to fix it. Like, it was really banging your head against the wall time and time again, expecting something different to occur.
I don't mean to interrupt you, but one of the things that drove me nuts, and there was a lot of people who would text me this, and I'm not sure if you noticed this, but there would be, it was almost every game, right? The other team would score, and Archie would be on the sideline, like, with his hand, like, let's speed it up. And the guy would be walking the ball down the court.
Yeah.
It's like, why is this not figured out before the game started? It was every game. I mean, and you wonder why people get frustrated watching it. I mean, to me, that's like a total disconnect. Something was not properly being communicated there, because it was every game. It was like Archie's telling them, let's push the pace, and the guy's walking the ball up the court. And I'm like, what's going on here? This is 4 seasons in, and they still don't really understand this basic concept. Did you see that? I mean,
yeah.
Did you notice that?
Absolutely. No, and it's
every game.
It was as bad as those moments were. It was also, there was almost no recognition of time and score. You would see the same walking up the floor thing at the end of games when IU was down a couple of possessions and they needed to score quickly, and it was baffling. I've heard a lot of people say, Archie Miller didn't become a bad coach, and I agree with that. I mean, I think he knows basketball, he understands the game, but if you're just looking at coaching as a strictly X's and O's perspective, that's one thing. But part of coaching is being able to motivate and communicate to your team what needs to be done in time and score situations. And that, I never saw that. Like, consistently over the course of 4 years, with a very few exceptions, it just felt like the team and the coach were on completely different pages. In some cases, the players on the team were on a different page from their teammates. It was very disconcerting, and it always felt like you were 1 or 2 plays away from just collapse, and that ended up happening often, and normally at the worst moments. So
yeah. I don't know that we want to put too much more dirt over the grave of this tenure, so maybe we should get to some Twitter questions.
Yeah, let's do one last thing, and this is different from, we're not trying to shovel dirt. I do think we need to post-mortem this stuff effectively and talk about what went wrong, because it is, I do think it's one of the things that I've seen over and over again is people saying, I was so fired up about Archie Miller, and I'm shocked that we're sitting here on March 16th talking about him getting fired after 4 years. And I do think we all saw what happened, but it is good to talk it out a little bit and try to figure out why it happened.
No, for sure.
And I'd love to hear 10 years from now, I'd love to see the oral history of like what went wrong during the 4 years of Archie Miller's tenure at IU, because it seemed like a sure thing that just didn't ever materialize. Let me ask you this.
It'll be real interesting to see where he goes next and how that works out too, right? I mean,
I think
he could end up at another mid-major school and really have things rolling.
I think
quickly.
I think he could end up at a lower tier Power 5 school. We've heard like Pitt as a potential landing spot. I think if North Carolina State ever moves on from Kevin Keatts, he'd be a natural fit there, being an alum. You can look at the on-court stuff and say, well, that's not going to be attractive. But his teams acquitted themselves well off the court, and you've now got 2 separate bodies of evidence. If you're a school, you can say, well, do we get the Archie Miller that was at Dayton and had things rolling, or do we attribute his problems at IU to being at IU rather than being specifically an Archie Miller issue? I mean, that's going to be what dictates the next steps of his career, but I wouldn't be shocked. It's not like a Richard Pitino situation where it's like, well, hey, we saw you for 8 years and it didn't work, so now go to New Mexico or something like that.
Right. I mean, I guess there was a scenario where if he stuck around at IU for a little bit longer, he could have maybe turned the corner, but I just don't think it was going to be so bad next season that I just don't think that it would have been healthy for any of the parties involved to actually see, to try that experiment to see if it would actually work.
Yeah, absolutely. let me ask this before we move on to the questions. I'm curious. We talked about the players and the way that the team struggled to fit together, and obviously we don't know who's coming back, who's going to be on the team up, for this next year. But when you look at IU basketball as an overall asset, as something that would be appealing or not appealing to an incoming coach, and you look at what's currently on the roster, how much potential do you think there is? I mean, is this a situation where the pieces are good and someone can come together and put together a 20-win season without a lot of tinkering, or do you see there needing to be a more complete overhaul based upon what an incoming coach is going to inherit?
Well, I certainly think if you can keep most of the core intact, which that was one thing I was thinking about with this transition period. I don't look at anybody on this roster. When Crean left, there was obviously guys who you didn't want to keep, right? But I don't look at any of these guys and say it would be a bad thing if that player stayed, right? Yeah. I look at all of them and say there's potential in some form, right, with each of these guys. I think the most important thing in terms of being able to be successful like next season is going to be what the new coach can do in terms of getting guys out of the portal who are going to be impact players. And I think those players are going to be there to be had, but it's going to be identifying the right ones and mixing them with what's coming back. I don't think we're going to see a mass exodus type of situation that we saw when Sampson left and Crean came back. I think Indiana's in good enough shape right now just as a program, and I think Scott Dolson's going to do everything in his power to try to keep as much intact as possible. My main thing that I'm hoping for a new coach is that, and it was interesting that Dolson used this wording when he talked. It was either in the release. I know you went through the release last night with Scott, or it was either that or in the press conference where he talked about getting a chief executive for IU basketball. To me, I think whoever it is that comes in needs to be given a little bit more leeway to run the program and put their own stamp on it. I think in many ways, IU basketball has a lot of great traditions, but I also think that there needs to be a realization that it's no longer 1987. I'm not saying that we need or that Indiana needs to put the names on the back of the jerseys. I'm not saying that the pep band has to be eliminated, but I think there's a lot of things that could be updated and renovated for a more modern experience in the way the program presents itself. And so I'm hopeful that whoever does get the opportunity to be the next head coach is able to kind of put their own stamp on it, because I know Archie Miller was able to get some things behind the scenes, like new locker rooms, and he was able to tweak a couple of things, but it still feels like, maybe things were a little bit micromanaged still. And I think it was interesting that Scott Dolson brought that up. Like, he's not going to micromanage the next coach. And I'm not saying that Scott did that with Archie. I'm just saying there's just a lot of things in terms of how the game day experience is run and just how the program presents itself that I feel like could be updated a little bit while still preserving the tradition. If you understand what I mean. Do you agree with any of that?
Yeah, I mean, I go back and forth on this a lot because I think that one of the big problems that Indiana institutionally has had for decades, like going back to the Knight era, is that they have allowed the coach of the basketball program to essentially have full control over the brand and the execution of the basketball program. And I just don't know if you can do that. I mean, I think with Bob Knight, you had to, because by the time that the brand of the basketball program became a thing that people thought about. He had won 2 national titles and was unquestioned like god of Indiana sports. I mean, growing up in the 80s, it was essentially a professional team. And he was always going to dictate that as long as he was here, but it allowed a lot of things to go a bit stale. And then you had this succession of coaches who either didn't have the the ability to manage all of that and coach. I think Mike Davis certainly falls into that category. Kelvin Sampson wasn't here long enough for us to see what that would have been. Tom Crean kind of lost interest. Like after, he put a lot of time and effort into trying to update the experience. Some people remember the whatever that was, like the disco party or whatever up in the balcony, but that was as much an outgrowth of needing to get some way of getting people in the building while the teams were terrible, doing stripe outs and things like that.
Right.
But he kind of lost interest in that after a while. And then Archie Miller never really seemed to have much interest in it at all. I do think that it's important to remember that facilities wise, it's going to be a gradual process. The locker room thing was important. There's probably more things that need to be done. But much like with football, that was a process that took like 15 years. And now that it's over, it's like, oh, look at all these cool facilities that we've got for football. With basketball, I think it's going to be an ongoing thing because they are so far behind the Joneses still in terms of the facilities and the sorts of things that top-level recruits are looking for in terms of an experience, not because they're entitled, but because they look at other schools and they say, well, Louisville's got that, and North Carolina's got that, and Nebraska's got that, and you don't have any of those things. So what's the deal? Do you not care as much? Is it, and the answer is to some degree always been, well, tradition this or tradition that. I don't think that's going to fly anymore. As far as the other items, I do think that and then as we get into talking about coaches, I think the perfect coach for IU is someone who thinks of this as a full service operation as opposed to just, I am the basketball coach and that's it. Like, you really do need to want to work with athletics, but also be entrepreneurial enough to develop your own idea of what the identity of Indiana basketball is, and getting out of the shadow of the Bob Knight era, not eliminating it, not turning your back on tradition and history, but not allowing what you do as a program to be completely overshadowed by the patterns that were set down 40 years ago, I think is a really important thing moving forward. It's 2021. At some point, Indiana basketball's got to move into the 21st century. So that's my perspective on that.
I agree.
So let's talk about the next phase here, as IU is looking for a coach. They didn't hire a coach last night, so we have not been spared the likely week or two of speculation that we're going to have going into this. Where are your thoughts right now on where Scott Dolson is likely to turn when looking for a coach, and what sorts of characteristics do you think are important in a coach being hired here?
Well, in terms of where he's likely to turn, thinking about this logically, based on the steps that he took to, one, come to the conclusion they needed to be change needed to be made, two, go to the president, tell them that he was going to get the money independently to make said change, and then three, actually go through with making the change. I kind of feel like he has an idea or a strong feeling that there are a couple of big fish in the pond who might be ready to take a bite. Otherwise, I don't think it goes down quite like that, because you would probably want to let it play out a little bit longer, right? And get a stronger feeling of what's actually out there. So I kind of feel like he's got a feeling of what he wants to do. In terms of the characteristics that I think need to happen, I mean, I think you laid it out pretty well. The thing I liked that he didn't do was, when Fred Glass made the move to Archie Miller, he talked about Big Ten championships and national and all this stuff, and it was like, all right, this is a bar that's going to be really, really hard for him to ever reach. I think Dolson was a little bit more calculated in his words, while saying that his expectations are for Indiana to kind of realize its potential. He didn't say things like Final Four. I think those are expectations, but I think he was maybe a little bit more realistic in terms of what he said about the position. But I do think you need to find somebody who is willing to embrace both sides of the job, which is, one, be a really good basketball coach, but also understand that being the coach at Indiana is just a lot more than coaching basketball. The thing that really stood out to me in terms of Archie not getting the job is, like, I never felt like he sold anything about IU, right? Like, publicly. Like, it was just, a lot of the things sell themselves. Obviously, the tradition, you have these big crowds and you have, people that follow your every move, but I don't feel like he ever embraced that. So I think the two kind of go hand in hand. You have to have somebody who's excited about all the other things that come with the job, and you also have to have somebody that can come in and I think hit the ground running and win games pretty early in their tenure, because I just don't think there's it's been so long now, there's no patience for anything like what we saw with Tom Crean and the slow ramping up. And after watching 4 years in a row of what fans just watch, and then they see what's going on at Ohio State and Illinois, where both teams are basically, top 5, 6 in the country after 3 or 4 years, they see it can be done. So it's a tough job for whoever takes it. But it's got to be someone who is taking it because they feel that there's untapped potential and that they're ready to kind of, I guess, wake up a sleeping giant would be the best way to say it. And that's going to take identifying the right fit, because Indiana hasn't gotten it right now with 3 or 4 straight coaches.
Yeah, no, it's true. And it certainly takes a certain mentality and personality to want to take over that kind of a role. And it's going to be interesting, because I don't know how many people will actually meet all of those criteria. There may be a perfect candidate out there that does all that, but that's a lot of things to put into the same box.
Well, I mean, what do you think's most important?
Well, look, I obviously, this is where, there's some very answers to this. Like, for me, it's like, well, they need to be able to come in and have a lot of energy and have the coaching chops to match that. Not just the X's and O's and this is the style we're going to play, but they need to be a good manager of people. And because I think initially, I do think there's enough talent on the roster. If you can convince it to stay and you can start to make it play together better and enjoy the basketball that it's playing, there's a potential to win games right off the bat. And the Big Ten, as good as it was this year, is not going to be as good next year. I mean, there's players graduating. There might be a coach or two that leaves. I think that you're going to see an opportunity to do some decent things as far as what IU can do basketball-wise. Maybe not win a Big Ten title, but certainly get back into the mix for a top 4 position in the Big Ten or something along those lines. So I think that's where we've had some older coaching candidates mentioned in this mix, and this idea that, well, IU needs to come in and have someone steady the ship. And even if they only give 5 or 6 years of good coaching, that'll be enough to get IU on the path that they can then hire the long-term solution next time around. I don't know if that's really where they need to go at this point, because I think to make this work, it's going to take a lot of energy and that kind of youthful vigor that you get out of a coach that's in their 40s and 50s as opposed to a coach that's in their late 60s. So something to think about, I guess.
Yeah,
but,
yeah. I mean, I assume you're talking specifically to Beeline there, because he's a name that's been brought up and discussed, and he's visible in terms that he was on BTN a lot this season, and people see what he did at Michigan. I mean, it's tough because there's a lot, I feel like, in that situation specifically, with kind of what happened in Cleveland and how it ended, and the factor with his son obviously was a part of what he did at one point at Michigan, and then had kind of a falling out in his own coaching career. I don't know all of the circumstances behind that. What I do know in terms of X's and O's in coaching, he's one of the best that there is.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know and I was listening to the Moving Screen podcast a little bit earlier that Brendan Quinn and Dylan Burkhart that cover Michigan and Michigan State, they were talking at the end of their last episode just about Beeline and, kind of him getting back into it. It sounded what Brendan had basically said from talking to Beeline was there was still kind of that hunger to get back into it. So I don't know if Indiana makes sense from the perspective of Beeline himself. I mean, it seems like maybe he would want to go somewhere where it wasn't as demanding in terms of just everything that has to be done. And from Indiana's perspective, as you mentioned, 5 or 6 years, if you do hire somebody that's 68 years old, you're looking at what, 5 or 6 years down the road, you're probably going to get somebody new as well. But
the other thing about Beeline that I think gives me a little bit of pause is Beeline was unquestionably successful at Michigan. He was successful at West Virginia. But I think it's important to note that in both places, it took him a few years to get going. And honestly, the team he inherited from Tommy Amaker at Michigan is not that different from the team that he would be inheriting from Archie Miller, a team that was an NIT caliber team, would win somewhere between 19 and 22 games, but never really could get over the hump, had talent that was fine, but wasn't a fit for what he wanted to do. And I do worry a little bit, it's if he was if it was like Ohio State a couple of years ago, where he's inheriting a team that's got a lot of talent but is kind of in the doldrums, I think it's a different story. But you're going to need to come in and really galvanize your team right off the bat for Indiana, because you are going to need some degree of success early on, I think, for people to get excited about what you're doing. And I just worry he may not have that long of a runway with what's on the cards at Indiana and what he's done before. So
it's a fair point.
I'm not trying to be picky, because I think, it's one of those situations where his resume is unquestioned in its success. It's just, it took a little bit longer than people remember for him to get to where he was going. And, Tony Bennett was kind of the same way at Virginia. Like, I would say the same thing if Bennett was being talked about quite a bit here. Not that there'd be any reason for him to leave Virginia, but,
but can you think of as a counter to that? Can you think of any examples? And the only one that's really coming to mind right now is Calipari when he took over Kentucky. Can you think of any examples where a guy just came in right away and just started winning at a super high level after a coach was fired?
Well, maybe not at a super high level, but I do think that if you can get pieces together. You can at least, I don't know. Is it going to take a year? Sure. And Chris Beard's a good example, like 18-14 the first year at Texas Tech, and then the second year they're in the Elite Eight. I think that's a reasonable type of turnaround. Maybe it's a bit unreasonable. I'm not sure. Indiana hasn't been to the Elite Eight since 2002. So maybe that's a pie in the sky sort of thing. But even just getting to a Sweet 16, finishing in the top 4 of the conference, I do think within the first couple of years, that's what a coach is going to need to do. And maybe Beeline's able to do it if he is indeed the choice. I'm not saying that he is, but I do worry about the energy needed to do that and get out on the recruiting trail and communicate with the fan base and do all the other things that are needed.
He would have to have a home run staff in terms of the assistant coaches that he brought in, I think, for it to be a viable plan and option, which maybe he can do that. I don't know. Yeah. The thing I think that draws people to him, and maybe to a lesser extent to Thad Matta, is that they've done it in the Big Ten, right? Like, they know the league. They've won multiple Big Ten championships. They've won Big Ten tournament championships. They've made deep tournament runs. So that they've actually done it. I think what people are expecting out of this hire is that is somebody that's actually done some of the things that Indiana aspires to do. Again, I don't think this is a situation where you can take a risk on somebody who's never done it at the Power 5 level. Are you in agreement on that? I just don't think there would be, like, people have thrown names like Porter Mosier at Loyola. I don't know a lot about him, but I looked at his resume. He's been to the tournament now. I think this is the second time he's been a head coach for 17 years. Are we basing his candidacy at Indiana over the fact that he made one run to the Final Four and is now in the tournament again? To me, like, if you're going to do this, like, get somebody that can do the things that need to be done in the first couple of years. Otherwise, why make the move?
Yeah, I agree with that. I think there are people who would be good at coaching at IU and would be very successful who maybe aren't necessarily They don't have the Power 5 pedigree as far as being a head coach. But I don't know that you can take that chance at this point, particularly with the amount of money that's in play, particularly with the reputation and the stakes where they are for IU basketball. And so I think if it's next year and you let Archie Miller go and the buyout's not that much and it's like, all right, we're hitting the reset, maybe there's a little more latitude. But making as decisive and as big of a move as Scott Dolson decided to make here, it does make you think, all right, they're going to swing for the fences on this and hope that one of the candidates that they would consider to be in that upper tier will be there and will be interested in coming. So, yeah, I agree with you on that. I think that it would be a real hard sell for a Dane Fife, for instance, to be the head coach at this point. Not because I don't think Dane Fife would do poorly. I think he might actually have the stuff to do really well at IU. I just don't know if the table is set to take that kind of a risk at this stage.
Right. I mean, that's really the problem with, and there's a lot of people who obviously want an IU guy, and I would have no problem with that if that's the direction that that it went. But you just look at all of those names, and there's so many questions with a lot of them. I mean, I know Dane Fife a little bit. I think he's a really bright young coach that knows a lot about the Big Ten, who I think is recruited successfully. But I just don't know that you get $10.3 million from a anonymous donor if that's going to be your move. I think the perception is that you're swinging for the fence here, and you better hit a home run. And the other thing is like, how many times is Indiana going to get a chance to do this? Like after a while, if it's going to, people are going to look at this as a graveyard for coaches if they don't get it right at some point. Because you look at Tom Crean, he had a decent kind of resume coming in from Marquette. He had been to a Final Four. He gets to Indiana. He wins 2 Big Ten championships in 9 years. Goes to 3 Sweet 16s. They get rid of him. Archie Miller is a good up and coming coach. Comes in, can't get it done. You bring in another guy and it doesn't get it done, and you wonder how many more times can they keep doing this?
Yeah. We had some questions from the folks on Twitter. Do you have any in particular you'd like to get to?
Well, I was just looking kind of at the list here. I mean, let's see. Someone asked, his theory is that Archie's downfall is wrapped up in head-to-head record versus Purdue, plus their program shape over his tenure. Thoughts on that, Galen? Any thoughts on the record against Purdue as a factor in terms of just those games, but in particular, plus what Purdue's doing in the optics of the fact that this season they brought in a freshman class, and a lot of those players are now playing huge roles on a team that's going to the tournament. Indiana brought in all these freshmen, and their best freshman on paper didn't play a single minute in the last game of the season.
I mean, it doesn't help. I don't think that Archie Miller was at all assisted by the fact that Purdue has been really good. I mean, this is arguably the best consistent string of Purdue basketball that we've seen in 25 years. And, I'm reminded of the mid-90s. Like, that was one of the things that caused a lot of consternation about the end of the Knight era was, Purdue was winning Big Ten titles and going to the Elite Eight, and Knight's IU team seemed to be kind of stuck in neutral during that time period, at least relative to what that era normally provided. So I think it was a part of it, but I think the overall record was worse. Like, I think you could go 0-8 versus Purdue if you were going, 13-7 in the Big Ten and going to the NCAA tournament. I don't think it would matter that much. But yeah, and conversely, I think you could be missing the NCAA tournament or finishing below 500 in the Big Ten. But if you had won 6 out of 8 versus Purdue, maybe you can point to that and say, well, at least we've got that going for us. But that neither of those things was happening, certainly, I think, contributed to the overall demise.
Agree. Tim asks, I think this is an interesting one. The NBA has become a 3 and layups league. This style has crept into college some. He mentions Nate Oates' Alabama team coming to mind. Does this play a significant role in Dolson's search, or will other things like head coach experience be more influential to his decision? I'll just say before you chime in, Galen, that I do think that a more modern style of basketball is something that Indiana should be looking for in its coach. You look at Indiana's inability to make three-pointers with any consistency under Archie Miller. It was a huge problem. That didn't never look like a system that was very fun to play in. And I got towards the end of it, I would tweet out a lot of shot charts from games, and there would always be like these long twos that they kept taking. And I'm thinking, all right, you either shoot a layup or something at the rim, or you shoot a three. Like there should be no in between. And I think that's an interesting point, just in terms of the style of play needing to be a little bit more aligned with what is being played at the NBA. Because ultimately at Indiana, right, you're trying to win at a high level, but you're also trying to get players who aspire to play in the NBA. And you look at the system, and I don't know that it was anything that really translates to the next level for these guys to prepare them for careers there. So I do think there's something to that. I think Scott Dolson mentioned it yesterday. Yeah. You listened to his press conference. He acknowledged that the style of play is something that needs to be seriously considered.
You said something on the podcast yesterday I think it was you, that I thought made a lot of sense, where Archie Miller, I don't know that what we saw from Archie Miller any of the 4 years was actually Archie Miller's brand of basketball. It always seemed like a compromise. I think in the first couple of years, it was a compromise based upon, well, we don't have that many players that I like, who I've specifically recruited, or they're not ready to play. And so it was certainly an inelegant way of playing on the offensive end. And then these last 2 years, it's been, well, we've got a big man and we don't have a reliable offense from an outside shooting perspective, so we're going to focus everything on trying to get a layup and a free throw, trying to get the ball on the low block. I don't recall, I watched a decent amount of Archie Miller's teams at Dayton. That wasn't how they played. And if that was a distillation of how Archie Miller's teams were going to play, at Dayton, you would have thought, okay, he's going to carry that over. He's going to have a system. I don't know that we ever saw an Archie Miller system per se. What we saw was just an offense of convenience based upon the pieces that were there that he felt like he could trust. And that, like, the circle of trust was very small sometimes. Sometimes it was just get the ball to Trace Jackson Davis and everybody else stand around. And that's kind of how it worked with Romeo Langford too. So much of the offense in Langford's year was get the ball to Romeo Langford and then everybody else just kind of stand around. And, so I do think that there are many different styles of play that will work at the college level. It's one of the great things about college basketball is there's not one uniform style that will win you games. But whatever you're doing, you have to be good at it. And what Indiana did under Archie Miller offensively was just, it never reached that point. And so I think for a new coach, you could have a new coach comes in that runs a variety of different types of systems, or different coaches running different systems. A lot of it to me is more the confidence piece than it is necessarily the system per se. But certainly having a more modern approach to the game would be great. I would love to see it.
And I thought Eamon on Podcast on the Brink, Eamon Brennan, made a really good point last week about the style of play is important, but it also winning is far more important. Look at what Tony Bennett has done at Virginia. Do you think that's a fun style of basketball to watch necessarily? No, but he said he mentioned that Virginia fans have gotten, drawn into it and they love it because it wins basketball games. They're cheering things like shot clock violations. I mean, that's kind of the identity of Virginia basketball, but it's the reason that they win games. And I think, fans will get on board with basically any system as long as it's winning consistently. If Tom Crean would have won, a couple more Big Ten titles and made the tournament every year, he'd still be the coach at Indiana. The basketball was in many ways a lot of fun to watch. I mean, there was games where they would make 18 or 23 pointers, and Yogi and Nick Zeisloft, all these guys were shooting 3 or 4 feet behind the free throw 3-point line. People loved watching that type of basketball. It's just the inconsistencies. So I think fans can be sold on any system but it has to actually produce the results for them to feel validation in that system.
Yeah, completely. I mean, and I often remind IU fans of this. Like, people will say, well, IU fans still want IU to run the motion offense. No, they don't. Like, they liked the motion offense because it was successful, not because it was the motion offense. They liked, the help man-to-man defense because it was successful. And it had nothing to do with we need that style of play. It was we like the style of play because it works. And you could have someone if Jerry Tarkanian had like a child who was growing up to be a great coach and they wanted to come in and do a run and gun thing, that's the original IU brand. Like IU's basketball foundations in the 20s and 30s and 40s were built on running up and down the floor and being faster than the opposition, and they won 2 national championships doing that. Like, the idea that there's any one style that has to be here, no, absolutely not. And I think it's one of the great things about IU basketball historically is that it was really on the vanguard of change at the college basketball level. Like, we take a lot of what Bob Knight did for granted, but Bob Knight was way ahead of the curve in terms of saying, hey, let's put an emphasis on defense. Just like Everett Dean and Branch McCracken were ahead of the curve in saying, let's put an emphasis on pace and conditioning and being able to outlast your opponents, not just in terms of scoring, but in terms of their physical stamina. So that, look, Anyway, I would love to see a more modern system. It would get IU, frankly, back to its roots as a leader in basketball as opposed to a follower.
For sure. I mean, the system only gets scrutinized if you lose, right? You win, play whatever system you want, and people are going to embrace it. Scrolling through here for any other questions that maybe there's some I don't know that we want to touch. I don't know if smooth operation asks, and Galen, I don't know if you have any thoughts on this. What does year 4 of success look like, regardless of who the coach will be in terms of recruiting, on court, and postseason expectations? I look at this one because I think it's important to not box yourself in if you're the athletic director and saying that you have to do a certain thing by a certain time, because that's how you end up in a situation where you're having to answer a lot of tough questions and being, scrutinized. I mean, obviously, I think Indiana needs to be in the top half of the Big Ten, preferably top 4 or 5 consistently. They need to be making the NCAA tournament. I would say 4 out of every 5 years. I mean, I think people would be obviously accepting if they're in the tournament 80% of the time. I mean, they've only been in the tournament 50% of the time the last 20 years, so that's an upgrade. And I think they need to be. The tournament is such a roll of the dice. It's hard to say, well, by year 3 you need to be in the Sweet 16, and by year 4 you need to be in a Final Four. I mean, you need to put yourself in a position where you're getting a favorable seed and have a chance to advance, while also recognizing that anything can happen in the tournament. I think IU fans are going to be pleased if they're just at the table consistently and feel like they have a chance to move on.
Yeah, I
don't know what else more you can ask for. What else can you ask for besides that? You can't say that by year 4 we need to have this many McDonald's All-Americans recruited and this many Big Ten titles and this tournament success. That's not going to work.
So much of it comes down to how IU looks in comparison to the other teams in the Big Ten. And, I think what's been disturbing is, Ohio State and Wisconsin and Purdue, Michigan State, like, those are teams that have established themselves a tier above IU basketball over the course of the last half decade or longer. And, okay, you want to get back into that. But I think you need to get ahead of Maryland. You need to get ahead of Rutgers. You need to get ahead of, you look at Illinois and Iowa, and it's like, oh, look where they went. They're at the top of the conference. Are they going to stay there? I mean, maybe, but that's the bar that you need to be thinking about for IU in the 4th year. To some degree, I think you can see relatively quickly when something good is happening with basketball. You can tell when a team believes in what it's doing and when there's contributing elements that are leading to a successful program. And, I think you saw that relatively early. I'll use Illinois as an example. You look at Underwood's time, first 2 years didn't look great. They won 4 games in the Big Ten in the first year, and then 7 games the second year. But then by year 3, things had recovered pretty well, and it's like that was a pretty decent team. That was a team that you were worried about, and then this year it exploded. Is that a trajectory that IU could have? Certainly, I think, if the thing is built correctly. But it could be, there's any one of a number of scenarios. I think ultimately what it comes down to is, by year 4, is IU legitimately competing for a top seed in the Big Ten? Like, are they there, in the double bye or whatever it is, the triple bye at this point? Or have they gotten themselves to a point where they are among the top teams in the conference again? And so to me, that's ultimately going to be the arbiter of success. And it's always a tough conference, but it's also a conference that Indiana has historically been able to do that in. And I think that when it's been at its best, whether it was under McCracken or whether it was under Knight or under Crean, it was a team that was in and around that area pretty consistently. So that's what I'll be looking for.
Yeah.
So.
Couldn't agree with you more. I don't know if you have the replies pulled up as
do.
well, but anything else that you saw in there that you want to address? I feel like we could.
The one thing
maybe continue this conversation for about 4 hours.
I know.
Yeah, to talk about.
There are other things to do today. I would like to briefly address the Stevens thing, because that has kind of gotten some legs here. So Brad Stevens, I'm not even going to give the normal preamble here. Is Brad Stevens coming to coach at IU? We've heard a lot of people, both in national media and in more regional media that cover the team, say essentially, 4 years ago there would have been no chance, and now I think there's at least a chance, even if it's a small chance, that Stevens might consider coming back. There's certainly some things you can argue in favor of that. The idea that Stevens he's at a natural break point with the Celtics at this stage. They kind of had their best shot to win a title, and that to some degree deteriorated through, I don't think, a huge amount of fault of Stevens. I think it was more of a personnel situation, but it has been a bit of an ugly year. And even though he's gotten a lot of success from Danny, or a lot of support from Danny Ainge, it's also one of those situations in the NBA where you're very replaceable as a head coach. It's much easier to replace a coach than it is to replace a player or a group of players. Obviously, the ties to Indiana, growing up as an IU basketball fan, the money isn't even that big of a deal in the big scheme of things. As I pointed out on Twitter, Tom Allen makes more money per year now than Brad Stevens does, which is kind of hard to get your head wrapped around and should tell you a lot about the economics of college athletics, but that's a different podcast. The biggest thing, if we put aside the idea that it's a fever dream that we shouldn't even be considering, which some people have put forward, the big question is the timing, Alex. And when you think about the NBA and the way that its seasons work, if you were going to bring a Brad Stevens in, it would be a very awkward wait to get to the point where, if things play out the way that they normally do, that Stevens would be able to even consider accepting the job, because he's still employed by the Boston Celtics, and one would expect that will be the case until the end of the NBA season.
Yeah, that's it has to be, it's going to be a topic of conversation until he comes out and publicly says that he has no interest and he would in no way take the job. He's going to be asked about it sometime soon, I would think, because it's being written about, it's being talked about. If he comes out and says forcefully that he has no interest, then we have our answer and we move on. If he doesn't, then I think it only makes it a little bit more interesting at that point. And hopefully we get to a point in the next couple of days or weeks where we have a little bit more clarity on the situation. But this narrative by some in the national media that IU fans are crazy for even considering it. You have to, I think if you're Scott Dolson, you have to at least poke around and see what's there, because to me, in terms of the names out there, if that were to ever happen, that's the one name that I look at and say, you would in terms of approval rating, you're going to get the closest to 100% if that's your hire. He checks all the boxes of what I think Indiana basketball fans would covet in a coach. He's won a lot of games. Obviously, at Butler, took them to 2 national championship games. He's been successful in the NBA. He's, in terms of understanding like changes in the game and analytics and all that, he's right there at the top of the list. It's just the timing makes it so difficult, because even if he were interested, I just don't see a path for him to take the job anytime before the Celtics season's over unless they fire him. And I mean, that seems pretty unlikely to me based on everything that Danny Ainge has said. But I do think it's a philosophical question for him, because NBA coaches are you're eventually going to be fired, right? I mean, he's in Boston, he's in year 8. So at some point, he's either going to take this team to the finals consistently and win a championship, or he's going to be gone. It's just the question of whether, when he's gone, does he want to go to another NBA job or does he want to come back to college? And only he can answer that. But I mean, until he comes out and says for sure, I'm not going back to college or I'm not interested, then people are going to continue to talk about it. And I don't think it's surprising that they do.
No, and look, I think that the way that I think you put it very perfectly, like the whole idea of no one knows what anybody wants. Actually, I think that Gary Parrish did a good job of talking about this on the CBS podcast yesterday. What matters in the abstract to a person just looking at a situation and saying, well, you need to do this or you need to do that, versus what that person actually values and thinks is important, are sometimes two very different things. To the to the person who's just looking at things from an objective or attempted objective perspective, they're going to look at it and say, well, no, Brad Stevens isn't going to leave the NBA to go coach Indiana men's basketball. Like, why would you do that? There's no real upside there, just from like the Celtics are among, if not the most storied franchise in the world, at least from a basketball perspective. So why would you do that? And yet we don't know what's in Stevens' mind. We also don't know, I mean, even if you get somebody coming out and saying, I'm not interested in the job, one of the things I'd like people who are listening to this podcast to keep in mind, there's a lot of dancing that goes on in public that doesn't match what's going on in private. There was a Jeff Goodman tweet that happened right before we got on air here that said, IU hasn't contacted Scott Drew or Chris Beard, which was surprising to him. And yet we don't know if that might simply mean, well, Scott Dolson hasn't specifically talked to those two coaches. It doesn't mean that intermediaries haven't been talked with. It doesn't mean that there haven't been people talking on behalf of each. There's a lot of cloak and dagger stuff that goes on behind the scenes in terms of these things. So you got to be careful, and I include the Stevens thing on this. You have to be careful taking the word of what you see published or tweeted, because sometimes the actual wording is accurate, but it's not representative of what's happening behind the scenes. And I think we've seen that with prior IU hires or almost hires, where it looked like people were not interested in the job that ended up with the job, or it looked like people weren't interested in the job, but then we found out later that they actually were, and they were close to being hired. I mean, there's been instances of this that have happened with every coaching search. So Stevens is obviously one of those that's going to draw an inordinate amount of attention. It might be because Stevens is actually interested in the job and has let that be known behind the scenes. It might be a big smokescreen. It might be one of those where Stevens isn't interested, but he's not going to come out and say it, because IU's like, we know you're not interested, but don't say it because that gives us cover as we look for other candidates. I mean, there's so many different ways that this could be looked at, Alex, that I don't want people to get too wrapped up in one candidate or another, either direction, just because of something that they see or read or hear.
Yeah. So let me ask you this. If you're kind of looking at, there's always these various lists out there of coaching candidates. What do you think in terms of, I don't want specific names, but in terms of the floor of what IU should be looking for in terms of a candidate, in terms of resume and kind of what they would bring? Do you agree with me that they're unlikely to go into like the mid-major ranks again?
Yeah, I agree. Unless it's an extraordinary set of circumstances where you, like, if you're Scott Dolson and you just 100% believe in Joe Pasternak or somebody like that as the next head coach, like someone who you've talked with them. I'll liken it honestly to Tom Allen as the being hired as the head coach for IU football. Like, it's easy to look at that now and say, wow, what a great hire. At the time, it's like you're hiring a guy who's never been a head coach at any major level, and you're hiring a guy who's been in your system for a grand total of like a year, and you're like, everything that we thought we knew about IU football was based upon this idea that it was going to take a veteran coach, a guy who could come in and knew how to run things right from the get-go and make this a discipline-oriented place where you could grind out results. And instead, they hire a guy with very little coaching experience and in terms of head coaching stuff, and essentially just a vision, an emotional vision of what it could be. And it's worked out brilliantly. There's no reason to say that couldn't happen at the college basketball level, but I think it feels like the stakes are a lot higher if you're IU basketball.
Yeah,
with
exactly.
with IU football, you can roll the dice on that. So all I'm saying, I tried to talk about this on the Chronic Hoosier podcast yesterday. I think there are a variety of scenarios that could land you the perfect coach. I don't know that IU has the luxury of exploring some of those avenues because of the state of the program and the way that the last few hires have gone. And so, when I think about a floor, to me, like, if he's healthy, Thad Matta is a tremendous floor hire for this program. And a lot of people, I think, have forgotten how amazing Thad Matta was as the head coach of Ohio State. It's easy to take the last couple of years and look at that as some kind of a representation. I mean, this is a guy that went to 2 Final Fours and, went to, an Elite Eight on top of that and several Sweet 16s, and had this ridiculous winning percentage in the conference over a long period of time, recruited at the highest level, 8 IU's lunch on the recruiting trail for a lot of key players in the state of Indiana, is younger than Tom Crean, and the big question about him is his health situation, if he's actually back and energized and not being weighed down by the health issues that drove him out of Ohio State. Like, to me, if that was a situation where IU felt really comfortable about Matta and what he could bring to the table physically and from an energy perspective, then frankly, I think that would be a wonderful floor for IU to be at. Are there other candidates who are in the game right now, who are coaching at this moment, coaching in the NCAA tournament, who might be better than that? Sure. I don't know how many of them actually match Thad Matta's pedigree at this point. So that to me is the big question mark. It's like, if he is indeed a candidate, how confident are you in his ability from a health perspective to be able to get the job done?
Yeah. Some late breaking news before we go. If you're wondering how soon it might be for Archie Miller to get a coaching job, Richard Pitino has been hired at New Mexico. So he was out of work for less than 12 hours?
Yeah.
And he's already at New Mexico. So
this is an advantage to doing this. Like, if the buyout mitigation is a thing that you're worried about, and you're asking donors to foot the bill for that, there's an advantage to making a move early, because it does give Archie Miller a chance to land somewhere else during this cycle, rather than waiting a year and eating that, the however much money that would be, $3 million. I think there's going to be some openings that Archie Miller will be in the running for. And so Minnesota, they fire Pitino. I don't know what Pitino's buyout was, but they're going to have to pay less of it now that he's at New Mexico than they would have if he had been doing television for a year.
Right. And it's kind of like dominoes are going to keep falling, right? Because the more jobs that open, it kind of, there's a trickle down effect, and other jobs have to be filled. So I'm not saying that he's going to get another job this year. I mean, who knows exactly how it all plays out, but you make an excellent point, and that doing it now kind of not only opens up the field for Indiana in terms of, having all the options out there that they may want to go after, but it also maybe increases the chance that Archie will go out and find another job. So
we got a lot more to talk about throughout the course of the next however long. I mean, we could find out something by the end of the week. We could find out something in June, depending on who the hire ends up being. I hope it's not June. I'm not sure
if it's in June. If it's in June, it better be. There's one person that it better be. So, right?
Yeah, it's I mean, I think that's going to be the really interesting thing is if it's June. I think we're either going to know at that point or we're going into next year with an interim head coach, and I don't think it's going to be the latter of those two scenarios. But anyway, I think that'll wrap it up. Any final thoughts before we finish off here?
No, I mean, I'm just I've been enjoying all the great content that you've been putting on the CrimsonCast feed. As I said, I mentioned listen to your conversation with Scott. It's you and Scott together just entertain me because he goes off on his tangents, right? And then you kind of have to reel him back in, and then you've got him. He's like the big fish. You got him back in the boat, right? And then he's going back out of the boat, and you reel him back in. So it's interesting. You guys do a great job with those podcasts, and I got to finish the one with you and Chronic. But are you planning to? How many podcasts are you going to go for this week? Is it going to be a record on the CrimsonCast feed? I'm
not sure if I'm going to hit the record. Although Scott is doing some independent of me. We're trying to look. This is always the take stock moment. This happened when Crean got fired. I've got 3 or 4 more lined up already for the next couple of days, and then we'll just kind of see where it takes us from there. I enjoy this. I enjoy talking about it. I think it's good conversation. I love being able to have you on and talk about things. Obviously, I appreciate the kind words. Inside the Hole is always the first place I go in the morning to check out what's going on with IU basketball. So, yeah, it's fun. It's good times, and I just I'm glad we were able to do this and add to the growing list of podcasts. I want everybody, when they're walking their dogs or driving from place to place, to have some kind of IU basketball content to listen to during this time, because we need to stick together as people that cover IU. IU fans need to stick together. This is always a trying time, but it's an exciting time at the same time, and so it's good to talk about.
People have energy again. They're excited again. Yeah. That's what we want, right?
Absolutely. So. Anyway, thank you for listening to this perhaps first ever combo episode of CrimsonCast and Podcast on the Brink. It won't be the last. We'll do this again probably when there's a hire, whenever that happens to be. So Alex, thanks again. I really appreciate it. And thanks to all you folks for listening in. I'm Galen Clavio. We'll catch you folks on the flip side. So long, everybody.